What's up guys? Welcome to this month's subscription box. This month we have a ton to go over, so I'm not gonna waste any time. Let's just go ahead and get right into it. So this is a huge announcement. This is a huge month to be a part of the subscription box. Super excited to show this off. Check this out. This is the launch of our Astrotech jewelry grade epoxy, and I could not be more excited for this. So we really just went all out on this sub box. We've got both your A and B mix of this epoxy, and don't worry, I'm gonna talk a lot more about that here in a second. Just mixing cups, stir sticks, just standard stuff you'll need, and then just all sorts of powders here. So this is new. These are our neon glow powders, and they're already pre-colored. I'll explain a little bit more about them later. There's a lot to these as well. So a lot of new stuff going on. We gave you the entire neon kind of fiesta pack here. And then let's see, one of these is glow powder, one of these is pigment. This here, aqua glow powder here, and then two different metallic pigments. These will give things just a really cool shimmer. So this is white, this is black. So that's the box. There is so much to go over. Where do I start? Let's just, I'll get into specifics of things as the video goes on, so I'm not boring you with a huge intro. So for now, let's pick our combos. I've already kind of thought it out. I want to do one that is just this pure neon yellow. I think this is going to look awesome. So just one all by itself, just like that, plain and simple, that with some epoxy. And then another one, I want to do black and white and clear. I think that's a really cool combination. You're going to see a lot of contrast, and the addition of clear is going to allow you to see into all the different swirling and mixing within the resin. So that will look really cool. So there's going to be number one, number two, and then I want to do at least a third one. I haven't quite decided. Why don't we just mix all of these together and see what cool effect we can get? Hopefully it's not too crazy, but we'll see. I'll decide about that later. Maybe I'll cancel that idea, come up with something better. But the whole idea is to just get you guys working with this epoxy, get you guys familiar with the properties, and just what you can do with all the different things. There's so much to it. These neon glow powders here, these do not have a shimmer to them, so they give you really nice consistent colors. These, however, they do a really cool shimmer, and there's reasons why you'd want it in some instances and sometimes you wouldn't, and so there's pros and cons to everything. In general, it looks amazing. It gives things a lot of depth and a lot of texture, and so it looks awesome. So just so many little intricate different things for you guys to figure out that I just decided, like, hey, for this month, we're just gonna throw as much as we can at you guys. There is plenty of epoxy in here for more than 10 rings. So you're gonna have plenty of fun and experimenting to do. You don't have to just do rings too. What's great about this is it's good for just about anything you can come up with a use for it for. So this is gonna be so much fun. I can't wait to get started. So that is just a very brief overview and introduction to all that we've got going on here. This is going to be so much fun, just absolutely crazy. Here are some notes that I've written down, just sharing these with you guys. Just kind of stuff I want to go over, and each of these bullet points I could talk about for probably like an hour each. So this is crazy. I'm just gonna kind of be scratching the surface with so much stuff here, but that's the whole point here, is to introduce you guys to a new medium to work with. And as we progress, as the months go on, we're gonna get really specific, and we're gonna go into different niches and explore all that, make sure that you guys become experts in every single little way. So this is a great starting point. Let's go ahead and get started, and I will talk more about specifics as we go. All right, so for a good starting point, I think for simplicity's sake, I'm going to start with just the neon yellow. We've just got one thing going on there. We only have one property to focus on. And for this, here's back to all of my talking points for this video. Bubbles, the strategy of avoiding them versus equipment to get rid of them. The biggest thing that I recommend is to avoid the bubbles in general. And one of the best and easiest ways to do that is to work with a larger quantity of resin. So if you know you want to make 5 rings out of this, rather than making 5 individual blanks all at once, mix up a larger amount that's easier to avoid the bubbles in, and then either pour it into blanks, pour it into a tube, however you'd like. So for this, I'm just taking some standard, like we just got these off Amazon. We'll probably have a link to them available to you guys somewhere. But this is just a mixing cup. You can use almost any cup. Just be careful. Some types of plastic resin can kind of eat away at it, so you don't want to use those. And like paper cups, just make sure they're not like wax coated. But for the most part, most things should work, and even if there is a little issue, it's probably not a big one. So what we're going to do, we'll take our epoxy here, and then I'm just going to mix out equal halves of it. I just switched out the epoxy. This is one that I've already opened, so I don't have to deal with the foil lid. So, like I said, because I'm trying to avoid bubbles, I'm going to do a larger quantity. So I think I will do, I kind of want to do, I'm going to do just under 2 ounces of each. So what's nice about this is it's all labeled out for me. So, you know what, I'll just do 1 ounce of each. 2 ounces total, that'll be enough for a lot of rings actually. So I will pour out my A side. So I've got that measured up. You guys don't see my perspective, and as I change it, obviously the level of the resin changes. But that's exactly 1 ounce. Now here with the B side, I'm gonna raise that to 2 ounces total. These are a 1-to-1 mixing ratio that makes life a lot easier. There we go. Yeah, that is so much more than plenty. I'm glad I didn't decide to do 4 ounces total there. All right, so I've got my resin all poured out. You can see it down in here. You'll notice I am not in any sort of big rush here. That's because this has a fantastic open time. You've got 30 minutes to work with it before it needs to be set in place. And that's gonna vary a lot, mostly depending on temperature. So I like to be a little bit faster than that normally, but really you don't need to be much faster. So first technique, first step in avoiding bubbles is to minimize the amount of mixing you do. So let's talk about how to do that. First of all, I'm going to zero out my scale so I can weigh just the resin. 64 grams. Now how much of this do I have? I don't have a 11.9. Okay, what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna add all of this. I know that I can add even more than that typically. So I've got 64 grams. Once that's zeroed out, I'm just gonna dump this whole thing in here. You can see the powder itself, when it's in the tube, doesn't look like that crazy or neon or anything. As soon as I pour it out, you can already see just how like wild it looks. And this, so that is roughly 9 grams to about 65 grams. So we'll call that what, like a 10 to 70 ratio, give or take. So there's about 7 times more resin than there is powder here, and you can go pretty extreme with that. You can add upwards of, well, you can do more than half. So I could have done up to 40 or 50 grams of the glow. But this should give you guys kind of a good like neutral look at the results you'll get. You can add more if you want more, you can add less if you want less. And a little bit does go a long way. You can see how nice and opaque that's getting. Okay, so as I'm stirring this, you'll notice I'm being careful not to go like up and down too much like crazy. I'm not whipping it, I'm not going super fast. I'm trying to avoid getting bubbles in here at all costs, because every bubble you add to it is going to be another bubble that you're going to want to get rid of somehow. So the best way to not have bubbles is to avoid them in the first place. So I'm just going nice and smooth and easy. Also, another thing that is great about the long working time that this resin has is it gives it time for the bubbles to raise to the top. So that is really critical, very helpful. And a really big thing I want to touch on is you do want to make sure that you mix the A and B halves really well. You want to make sure that they are completely mixed. There's no pockets of just A and no pockets of just B, because you're not going to get a solid cure. It's going to stay tacky if you don't. So do a good thorough job, but do be careful not to get too many bubbles in there. All right, there we go. That is nice and mixed up. Also, here's a little trick. If you want to know what your resin is going to look like once it's in a ring, because it's a little bit hard to tell. This is like, it looks like it's completely opaque. Once I pull it out on the popsicle stick, it's a little bit see-through. You can kind of see that wood tone down underneath. So that thickness there, that's about the same thickness of a ring. So that's just a trick I do to try to get a preview of what it's going to look like. But as you can see, that glow powder was very potent. So now that I'm ready to pour it, rather than using this here, because I've got so much here that it would fill more than one of these, what I've done is I've got this little scrap of PVC pipe and then this little scrap of wood, and then I just hot glued it to this base. I made sure that there's no holes underneath where it can seep out, but other than that, that's all there is to it. I've got some mold release. You can use this if you want. You don't need to. It's just gonna make it a lot harder to get it out of the mold when you're done. But the nice thing about PVC pipe is it's easy to machine. So you can just throw it on your lathe or whatever you've got and machine it down, machine it out of existence. So I just sprayed a little bit of that in there. I'm gonna go ahead and pour. It's probably been about 5 minutes since I started mixing. That means we've got an extra at least 20 minutes to go before this starts hardening. So not in any rush. That I think is the best thing about this resin, especially if you guys are just getting started. It's always super stressful, super difficult to try to deal with a resin that's going to harden on you. Oh, it looks like we're gonna fill this up. Yep, that was way more resin than we needed. Okay, so I'll just pull out one of the medicine cups we included, fill this one up as well. All right, I've got these all poured. I gave them about a minute to settle, and as you can see, some of the bubbles have started raising to the top. As you pour them, it's a little bit deceiving. It looks like there's no bubbles at all in there just because of the opaqueness of the resin. So it's good to get these poured and in the mold so that they've got enough time to let the bubbles raise to the top before it begins to harden. So now I'm looking at my notes here, bubbles. So we talked a lot about that with our mixing technique, just trying to avoid as many bubbles as we could in general. Very good idea to do that. But let's talk about some equipment here. There's kind of there's a lot of different options. A pressure pot or a vacuum chamber are the two most common talked about things, but those are pretty expensive. They require a bit of a bigger budget. So I wanted to talk about maybe some options that would be available to you guys just around the shop. This is just a random orbital sander. I put duct tape on the top to protect the little like Velcro underneath. All I'm gonna do is I'm gonna turn this on. I'm going to put this on the top of it. It's gonna help vibrate those bubbles up to the top. And so it's not a perfect solution, but it's a lot better, especially if you just got one laying around, it's a free solution. All right, so that's this first one done. That just helps encourage the bubbles to break free if they're stuck to the wall or just trapped down in the resin and raise to the top faster. So now I'll do it to the second one. You can already see, even just looking at the surface, this one's better off as far as bubbles go. This one might be a little bit tricky. It's a little bit full, so it might start spilling on me. All right, so that does help actually quite a bit. That is a awesome technique to have at your disposal. And then another thing that's great about this epoxy, again, I've got my list here, super heat resistant. So if I take a blowtorch, I can use that. That'll just instantly pop some of those bubbles on the top. So as the bubbles come to the top, you can just kind of hit it with the torch. A lot of other resins will burn if you do that. These won't. So as long as you're careful with it, you should be able to do that as you please. A lot of the times it doesn't really matter if you have bubbles at the top when it comes to ring making, but say you're using the resin for something else, like maybe you're using it as a top coat and you're coating like maybe a knife handle with it. You can put this resin on a paintbrush, coat a knife handle in it. You don't want those bubbles on the surface, otherwise you're gonna have to sand down through them and deal with all that headache. So you can just zap them away instantly with the torch. Also, kind of a bummer here, little particles that were, probably old like sawdust or something on the orbital sander got off on the top in that resin. So, very sad, but again, because these are rings, 4 rings, we're not even gonna be using that part of the resin, no worries. Okay, so we've got these done. I'm going to leave these how they are, and then I'm going to make rings out of them. There still may be a few bubbles here and there in them, and I want to show that to you guys. I want to show you guys what you can expect. And then for another one, I'm going to use a pressure pot, and the other one I will use a vacuum, and then that'll help us determine just all the different properties and what is good for what and what you can do with the equipment that you have. All right guys, before we move on to this next step here, I was just rushing into this video. I completely forgot to put on a pair of gloves. Luckily this first one was straightforward enough that I didn't get it on me. You don't want to get resin on you just because it's really annoying and sticky. Okay, now let's move on to the next one. I'll set these aside. The scale, we'll be using that here soon enough. And then let's pull these two out. For these ones, we're gonna be doing really small quantities. I think I might even use all three of these in one batch. What's nice about these is you can generally reuse them. If you mix some resin in this, if you give it like an hour or two to cure, it becomes a little bit tacky. You can usually just peel out the residue that's left in there. All right, for this next one, there are a lot of properties at play here. I think right off the top of my head, I can think of at least 4 different things that went into my mind when I was thinking about this combination, and properties that are good about the resin, properties that are good about these pigments, etc., that will help us with the technique that we're doing. So I'm grabbing this bottle. This is a bottle, I just got a bunch. There's probably enough to make at least like 8 rings that I just poured, and I'd already used this in a couple of tests earlier, so we still got like 2/3 of this left, so it is lasting us really well. But what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna go ahead and pour out just a little bit in each of these cups. I'll use such a small amount for these ones, so almost like a negligible amount. It's gonna be hard to measure actually. I'm gonna try to do 5 milliliters. Let's see, the A mix is a little more gooey, the B mix is a little more runny. So when I'm starting off, it's a little bit easier to pour the B mix first. Doesn't really matter. Oh, I put way too much. Okay, well, we're gonna do a little bit more of this one. If there's any excess, we can pour it into a different container and make it into a different ring. Okay, so there's 10 milliliters of B mix. I'm gonna try to do 5 in this one. Oh, this one's turned the wrong way. There we go. Okay, how are these looking? That one's perfect. This one needs just a drop. There we go. A little bit more in here. All right guys, I've got 3 little cups poured out. I'm gonna go ahead and start mixing them. Again, because I have so much open time, I'm not really worried about the cure time being too quick on me. So just mixing them, relaxing. I'll talk to you guys, explain a lot of different things. Then we'll add the pigments here in a sec. Should be good to go. And then as you can see here, because we're mixing them in this small container here, it gets so many more bubbles mixed into it. Because I'm just moving around the majority of the liquid in there with each swipe. So a lot of air is able to get down underneath it and trapped. So to avoid bubbles, do a bigger batch and then just be more careful about how you do stuff. And then I'd recommend having this poured in there beforehand. But on this one, I'm planning on using my pressure pot. So I'm not even worried about that. Just mixing it up. Not a care in the world. Now, I'm not gonna worry about using a new popsicle stick on this next batch. I'm just gonna wipe that off so I keep my volumes consistent. And go ahead and start mixing. I'm gonna mix it again once I put the pigment in, so I don't need to be super thorough this first time around, but it's good to get it all swirled together and start activating. All right, I got all of these mixed. I just set a 15-minute timer, and at that point, we will begin to start pouring them together. But while these are sitting here, I want to talk about what we're going to do here, what strategies we're going to employ, and the things that I have thought through ahead of time so that we can avoid potential issues. So one of the first and biggest things is densities of our materials. What I'm trying to get here, what effect I'm trying to get, is a really cool swirl pattern where we've got black swirling through, white swirling through, and then a clear one that gives it depth, that allows you to see into the design so you can see all those different swirls interacting together. So it's really important that all three of the materials that we're working with have a similar density, because if one is heavier than the other, that one's going to just sink to the bottom. It's going to ruin all the swirls, and then it's also going to be a lot more boring because there's not swirls when it's just sitting at the bottom. So what's important is these metallic pigment powders here, these are very, very similar weights, even though they're different colors. And so one thing that's important to know is that I'm not using glow powder. This glow powder is a lot more heavy, and I'll prove it to you. Even in the packaging, you'll see the difference. That one, 13 grams. This one, 5.7. So this, you know, with the weight of the vial factored in there, it's an even more extreme difference. But all of that goes to demonstrate that if I were to mix glow powder in one of these, that would give us problems. So what you want to do is just make sure you're always got even, equal, consistent things. And there's techniques you can do to try to skirt around that. Like maybe you can wait to the last minute to pour them so that they don't have time to settle to the bottom. So you got to be really careful and know like the correct temperature to mix it at and the exact timing. I'm talking like down to a 30-second discrimination between when you pour. So maybe at like 25 minutes and 30 seconds, that's when you pour it all together. That's the kind of specificity that you're going to have to get down if you want to do techniques like that. This is just pretty simple. Because these are so light, it's not really going to make them much more dense than the clear, and so we should be good to go there. And that's just going to leave us with those better mixing results like I'm talking about. And then another thing I want to talk about that is specific to the Astrotech that you'll notice, this resin, it's not super thick, but it's also not very runny. We tried to pick a really neutral viscosity. You can see I wrote down there. And that's important for swirling. If you've got a resin that's really thin, and that can be good for some things, like if you're trying to infuse carbon fiber, for example, an infusion resin needs to have a really thin viscosity. But if you're trying to get deep, dramatic swirls that hold their shape and stay in place, you need it to be a little bit thick. So we kind of tried to pick a perfect medium and balance that's going to work with anything that you guys are doing. So I think this is perfect. And then the next thing I wanted to hit, just the fact that the resin's crystal clear. We're doing a clear one, and so that means we can't have a resin that's going to go yellow on us because it's not going to be masked by the pigments that we add. So very important to be using a crystal clear resin here, and also important to note that this is very UV resistant. There's an additive that we add to it that keeps the UV damage from the sun or anything else from damaging the resin. And then just some other things, it's very strong, just high tensile strength for this epoxy in general. That's just very important for rings where you're making such small things out of it. It's heat resistant, I talked about that earlier. That's going to be good in terms of allowing you to use the blowtorch to get rid of bubbles, as well as a lot of other instances where maybe you're carrying a hot mug in one hand, you don't want it to ruin your ring, or you don't want the heat. Maybe it's a hot day or you leave your ring in a hot car. You don't want that heat making your ring malleable, pliable, ruining its strength, anything like that. So very important to have that. And then just the long working time that we've got, very, very convenient here, so I can talk to you guys and bore you while we wait for this. And then other things I wanted to talk about, mixing techniques. That's why I'm waiting so long here. As you can see, the yellow that we mixed up earlier, that is still runny, like completely runny. So that is really nice. That means the bubbles are all rising to the top. It's given us time. Every few minutes, I'm just popping it with the blowtorch, getting rid of the bubbles at the top. So as those rise up, they're getting out of the resin. We're gonna be left with a much better cast. And then densities, we just talked about that. The mixing that we're going to do, because I set that timer, once that goes off, we're going to mix these together. And I think, I set a 15-minute timer. I think I'm gonna set a 5-minute one after that. And then at that point, we'll mix them. That way, these won't have too much time to move around until the resin starts to cure. That way we can hold the swirling in shape. And then also with mixing techniques, you just want to make sure that in the first place you don't mix the materials too much. So I'll talk about that. It's good to have some swirling. And so what I like to do is I just like to stick the popsicle stick down in and just swipe it across, and do that once, maybe twice, but like hardly ever do I go more than that. So just being really subtle with the amount of mixing you do, because a little bit of mixing goes a long way as far as patterns go. And then the final thing I wanted to talk to you guys, I know this has been a lot of stuff, but there's just a ton of information that I want you guys to begin to understand. I'm going to use the pressure pot for this. I'm not going to use the vacuum because the vacuum, as it bubbles, is going to ruin your patterns. So that would be perfectly fine for something that's color fast like this. It's all one consistent color throughout. That's not going to be ideal for these because it'll really kind of mess up our mixture there. And it could be, you could use that to your advantage in some instances, but for the most part, if you're trying to keep swirls in place, you got to use that pressure. So I'm going to use that pressure. And then another thing, I'm going to have plenty of extra clear. I think I'll just leave an extra clear casting left over. That'll be a great example for you guys to show a nice crystal clear casting once we put it under the pressure pot, and just show you guys how nice this resin actually is. So that's everything. Let's go ahead and start mixing in our metallic powders. All right, because density is important, again, I am going to try to keep things equal. So at this point, I need to get fresh popsicle sticks for every different batch because I don't want black pigment getting in the clear resin and so on. So I'm going to separate them all out. The black pigment, I'm gonna open up here. And I don't need to be super exact about this. All I'm going to do, I'm gonna pour out a cap full of black, and then I'll add it to the resin. I'll swirl it in and I'll see if that's the amount that I want. If I want more, I'll add more. And then however many capfuls I do of black, I'll add of white. So super straightforward, super easy. There's the first one. This is probably going to be way overkill, honestly. All right, I've got that all mixed up. Let's do a color sample on the popsicle stick. What's really important to note here is how opaque that is. I kind of wish I did a little bit less so that I could show you guys what to not do. But that's just super helpful. You know that one capful for this amount, this is 15 milliliters of resin. That's not even beginning to eat away at the amount of black pigment that we supplied you guys with, so there's more than plenty in there. And this is super, super opaque. Even when I thin it out a lot here, I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna scrape away most of it. You can see it gets a little bit transparent there. It's kind of really hard to get a good in between. But right there, that's about how thin it needs to be to tell. And that is, I cannot even see the slightest hint of popsicle stick through that. So that's good, and that's very important because when we're casting this, when we're doing those thin, teeny little swirls, they're not gonna stand out unless they're super opaque. So I always try to get bright, bold, and vivid, contrasty swirls. Unless you're trying to do a different effect, which there could be a couple reasons to do that, I'd recommend making sure you've got plenty. And what's nice about these powdered dry pigments here versus some of the wet ones, a lot of the wet pigments can ruin your resin. So if you add too much of it, your resin will never cure. It'll never fully harden, and it'll ruin your whole project. So what's nice about these is they don't really do that. You can kind of add as much as you want. Obviously you don't want to go too crazy, but you could probably do like 4 times as much as what I'm doing here and still be totally fine. So there's a cap full of white. I'm going to mix this up. Once that is mixed, we're going to be ready to pour, but again, we're going to give it a little bit more cure time. That way, these will be really sticky when we mix them together. And that way we'll keep our patterning nice and consistent. All right, it has now been 15 minutes since I poured all these. They're all mixed, ready to go, and they are still really nice and runny. As you can notice over here, the yellow is even still quite runny. So I'm giving that at least another 10 minutes. I'll keep an eye on them. While these are sitting here, I wanted to talk about pressure and vacuum pots, your options and what's good for what. Here's my pressure pot. It is a modified paint mixing can from Harbor Freight, and these are really kind of sketchy. They're very dangerous, and for that reason, I pretty much can't really recommend you guys use them unless you really know what you're doing. They are, I don't know, they're just really scary. You want to make sure that you have every safety precaution you can. This is a emergency release valve, for example, and then I've also got a pressure gauge here to tell how much pressure's got in there. I never get even close to the PSI limit that this has, and even then, I'm still a little bit scared to use this. It's just kind of, I don't know, not something I like using. But vacuum, on the other hand, if you ever had a catastrophic failure with that, you'd have an implosion rather than an explosion, and that is much, much safer for a lot of different reasons. I won't get into that, but essentially, it's just a lot more foolproof, a lot better to use. So let's talk about how we could avoid using a pressure pot and how we could use a vacuum chamber. And what's nice about a vacuum chamber is you can kind of put one together yourself. All you really need is a vacuum pump. The rest of the stuff you can kind of craft from different things, whether it's a glass jar from Walmart, using silicone for the gasket, all of that. I could even make a tutorial video on how to put together a nice kit, but they are a bit more affordable. They don't require an air compressor. All you need is the vacuum pump in your chamber, and then they're just a lot safer, like I said. So I really like vacuum pumps for that reason. So let's talk about how could we get similar results with a vacuum pump. So as you can see, this clear resin here, right now that's got a bunch of bubbles in it, and those are gonna race to the top, but this would not be a crystal clear casting. If I wanted it to be crystal clear, I should have been much more careful with how I mixed it. And if you're not doing larger volumes, there's almost no way around that. So in this case, we're really just stuck with a lot of these bubbles being in here. So what you can do is I can take this over to the vacuum, I can put this in there, and I can get rid of every single one of those bubbles. After just probably 3-4 minutes in the vacuum, it's going to have stopped bubbling constantly, and it'll just do kind of like a low, kind of like a simmer, which like water would do if you're like simmering a soup, whatever. So it'll just kind of be like a low simmer of bubbles that are coming off. At that point, if you release the pressure valve and you let the pressure back in, all those bubbles are going to completely disappear and you'll be left with a crystal clear resin. At that point, that got rid of 100% of the bubbles that you're beginning with. Now all you need to do is mix it with all these other colors, and what I didn't mention is you should do that with all 3 of these. So if you degassed all 3 of these, you'd get rid of all of the bubbles that are currently in there, and if you just let them set like that, they would give you perfect bubble-free castings. But for this one, we want to mix it after that fact. And so what you can do is after you degas them, you can pour it in here, and as you pour and mix it in, you're going to introduce a few more bubbles, but it's a minuscule amount compared to how many are in here right now. So that's a way that you can eliminate, like say 95% of all the bubbles and voids, is to degas them first before you mix it. So that's a way to avoid, and again, we don't put it in the vacuum after we combine the 3 because we don't want the bubbling from the vacuum to mess up our patterning and our swirling. So that's why we don't do that. So that is a way around it, but the only way to get it mixed and set in place and to get all of the bubbles completely gone is to use the pressure. So for this one, I'm going to use the pressure pot, but you could definitely get almost the same, probably to the human eye, you would get the exact same results with the vacuum. It's just a little bit more inconvenient and a little bit more inconsistent, but that's how you would do that. All right, it has now been a full 30 minutes since we mixed these. They're starting to get a bit set up, a lot more gooey than they originally were. Let's go ahead and start pouring these. I'm gonna use a bit of mold release just to make removing it easier. And as far as mixing technique goes, it's pretty simple. You just want to do a little bit at a time and just switch the colors frequently. And then you want to be nice and gentle. So just pour it in nice and smooth and switch colors. You can put the black on the right side, the white on the left side, and then switch it up halfway through just to make sure you've got all sorts of variants. What I might start doing is like clear intermittently between each layer. I'll try that out. There's no wrong way to do it. So put black on the clear. I'll put clear in the black. White again, and then just repeat. All right, let's call that good. That's more than enough for a ring blank. That should be perfect. Now to mix it all together, I'm taking the stick I used to mix the clear, and then I'm just going to do one stripe across it. I'm holding the popsicle stick parallel to the direction I'm going, and then just do that. Out and done. That should really kind of mess up the inside there. That's going to be cool. So now what I need to do, the only important thing I'm focusing on is this blank that we made. This should be perfect. I'm being gentle with it. I don't want to rock it around too much, mess it up. We need to put it in the pressure chamber. What I'm going to do, what I decided, I've got 2 blanks of this. What I want to do is show kind of what pressure will do and what a lack of pressure will do, we'll say. So we're gonna see how well that vibration method worked on this one, but this piece here, I'll put that in the pressure pot, and that should get rid of the bubbles. It's a little bit hard at this point, so it might not be successful, but we'll see. And I'll just throw that in here too, because I don't want this excess blank to be bad quality either. All right, so opening this up, got a nice flat surface down at the bottom here. In fact, I can remove it. It's just a little piece of a cutting board I cut out. I'm going to put this, I need something to prop this up on. Again, just so I can keep that at an angle. Put that one there. Now I'm ready to put it in place. All right, there we go. Now I gotta put the lid on. Being nice and careful. Need to screw each of these on pretty tight so you got a good secure fit. Okay, those are good to go. Safety valve is in place. I've just got my compressor here. Attach that. I made sure that the valve was shut off beforehand. Then I'll slowly start letting it in. Anything above about 40 PSI is gonna really do an effective job of getting rid of the bubbles. This is rated for 60 PSI. I don't ever go above 50. So I might go for about, I'll go for about 45 PSI. There, okay. Now all I need to do, need to let this sit overnight because this is about a 24-hour cure time on here. I'll let this sit overnight, cure up, and then we will pull it out, check it out, and see how the rings turn out. All right, let's talk strategy for this final casting we're doing. We've got a lot of colors here, so we kind of have to be careful on how we go about things. If we really mixed them up a lot, we'd kind of just have a gross blend of all of them. So I'm going to try to keep them separate. There's still going to be plenty of swirling and mixing going on, but that's kind of besides the point. That's going to happen anyways. But what I'm not going to do, I'm not going to use the popsicle stick to smear any of the colors, anything like that. We'll just try to keep them fairly separate. And of course, you guys can do things how you want, but I think that's what's going to be best. Now let's talk mixing strategy. I want to go for efficiency here. We got a lot of colors to work with, just trying to not make this take forever. So I'm going to mix a big batch of just clear. Then I'm going to mix that up, get it starting on its cure time. That'll give us a 30-minute window on how long we can use it from there. At that point, I'm going to go degas it in my vacuum chamber, and we should have a nice bubble-free casting. And then at that point, as you can see, I've salvaged 3 of these medicine cups from earlier. and you can see they still got a little bit, like there's some white resin on there. As long as it doesn't flake off, that won't affect anything. I've got a few more, these are different medicine cups, they're not as nice. I had these laying around. I will use these in case I need extras. But what I'll do is I will pour out, we got 5 colors, so I'll get, let's see, maybe I'll pour into this one. So I'll get 5 medicine cups out. I will pour out an equal amount in all 5 of these, and then I will put an equal amount of glow powder into all of these, and that's important. Do not miss that step. You gotta have an equal amount of resin, and you need to have an equal amount of glow, because density is going to be important in this instance, because especially with glow powders where they are quite dense, they are quite heavy, they're gonna have a tendency to wanna sink to the bottom if you've got a lot of them in there. So we're gonna have our 5 carefully measured out containers of each. Again, the resin's already gonna be mixed and activated over here. So once we pour it in here, all we need to do is mix in the color. So you don't have to mix it as thoroughly, because it's a lot easier to mix in color than it is to mix the A and B halves. So once we've got all 5 of them poured out, I'm just gonna have a teeny bit of each. I'm going to then pour them one at a time into this single container here, and then we will have our blank, and it should kind of fill up all the way to the top. It should give us more than enough room for 2 or 3 rings. So without further ado, I know that was a ton of talking, and I know it's been a lot of talking on the other rings to this point, but this is seriously, I think, the end of all my talking. Everything else should be very straightforward as far as crafting the rings after they are done and cured. So that is all you're going to hear from me for the most part. I promise I'll keep it simple from now on. Let's go ahead, do everything I did, get it poured. We'll wait overnight, let it cure and completely harden, and then we will check back in with you and finish making these rings. All right, so I've mixed together the resin and I'm just degassing it here in this glass vacuum chamber. And the way the vacuum works is obviously it's a vacuum, so it pulls all of the air out of the glass chamber here, and it gets rid of the standard air pressure. And I believe it's something about 10 PSI. Whatever it is, the number doesn't really matter. All that matters is the concept. So essentially at any given moment, you have all sorts of air pushing on you. Every single person has air pushing on them. The resin has air pushing on it. The bubbles inside the resin has air pushing on it. And so once you release that air, if you pull it out with the vacuum, you're able to expand those little bubbles because they no longer have the air compressing them down. And so when those bubbles expand, they grow to be hundreds of times larger than they were before. And so they go and they release and the bubbles float to the top because they get so big. And then once you put the pressure back into it, it kind of works in the same way that a pressure chamber does, where now all of a sudden there's a lot more pressure than there was before. So all those bubbles, they collapse completely and it gets rid of every single one of them. And you'll see it working in real time here on the video.
Look at that, water clear. Nice. Let's pull this out and take a look down into it. Perfect. Lighting's not great over here, but as you can see, no bubbles.
All right, resin is perfect, crystal clear, just the way we like it. I'm going to start pouring it into each container. And I think I'll weigh it out just because I don't want to have to bother looking at the marks on each of the different cups. So just need a tiny little amount of each resin. That should be good. That's 2.5 grams. All right, I've got roughly 3.3 grams in each of these. Now I'm going to put a cap full of glow powder into each. This doesn't have to be a super exact science, I guess. It's just good to be pretty accurate. And for you guys' reference, I did about just over 3 grams of resin and just over 2 grams of glow powder is what that turned out to be. So what I would recommend is never add more glow powder by weight than you do resin. So if you do 3 grams of resin, don't do any more than 3 grams of glow powder. But if you want it to be perfectly opaque, I'd say do at least half the weight. So for 3 grams of resin, do about 1.5 grams of glow powder. And then if you want it to be a little bit transparent, I usually do about 1/10 of the weight. So it allows the ring to be a bit see-through, but a bit glowy still. That's just a good rule of thumb for future reference. All right, I've got all the glow powders weighed out. I've also got a lot of excess resin here. So what I'll either do is I will either go in and maybe do a second batch of these after I do this first one, or maybe I'll integrate clear into the mix so that we can have some separation between all the colors. I don't know if I should do that. I already did it on one. Maybe it would be better to avoid that. Yeah, I won't do it. I already did it on the black and white ring. We'll go for a different look on this one. Now, I am going to grab, these are just, got these at Walmart. They are for like popsicle making. They're just like rolled up paper sucker sticks. I'm using this instead of a popsicle stick because it allows me to stir it in without producing nearly as many bubbles. So because I already vacuumed it and it's already bubble free, I want to do my best to keep it that way. So I'll just gently mix it in. And if this isn't mixed perfectly, it's not going to be the end of the world because, like you guys saw, we already mixed up the resin very thoroughly. So we're not going to have any problems with it not curing. There we go, I'll call that good. I've got a fresh sucker stick for each color, but orange is similar enough to red that I'm not going to waste this stick, and I'll just reuse it. Maybe I'll use the same one for all of them. We'll see how it goes. All right, I'll call that good. I'm just trying to mix it with as minimal number of strokes as possible. You still want the color to get in there nice and evenly. So just mix it till it's barely good enough and then stop. Look at how bright and vibrant these colors are. I know how I talked about it earlier, how they'd really kind of brighten up. You see that orange is kind of like pale and pastel looking? It's not once you add the resin to it. So that's why they call these the neon colors. They are very bright and neon in color. And this ring's gonna look awesome in the day, but when it's really gonna look crazy is at night, because each of these glows a different color. It's gonna look completely insane. All right, there's all of the colors mixed. They're looking good. Not very many bubbles because I was very careful to avoid introducing them into the mix. Now it's time to pour them into our mold cup here. And one thing I'm going to do, I'm going to try to separate the like colors. So orange is going to stay away from red, and this blue, this one glows aqua, and this is blue. Those are kind of similar. So I mean, here I'll do it in this order. but still gonna put these next to each other. I think, there we go. Here's the order I'll pour them in. And on this one, I'm not letting these cure. Like the last one I did, I gave it a good, I think it was a full 30 minutes before I poured them. This one, not nearly as much time has passed, so they're gonna be a bit more blended. Not that it's necessarily a bad thing, but we'll just see how the results end up looking. All right, there is the first half of the resin used up right there. It's a little bit, we kind of have no idea what this is actually going to look like until it has fully cured and we get to cut into it a little bit. So, looks completely crazy right now. I'm really liking where the colors are blending a little bit. It's got some really cool kind of tie-dye look to it. So we'll see how that turns out. It's just kind of like we get a little bit of an indication of what it's gonna be, but we'll never know. All right, I still have probably more than half of the resin remaining here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to repeat everything I just did. I'm setting this, the first one aside. I'm going to repeat everything we just did, except for I'm going to wait, just like I did with the black and white resin we did. I'm going to let it wait for about, it's been about probably 10 minutes now, so I'm gonna give it another 20 minutes until it starts really firming up. Sorry, I couldn't talk there. And so once it's firmed up a bit, I will then mix them. That way the colors don't bleed as much as they have in this one. And we'll see how we like each of them. They'll have different looks, and maybe someone will like one for one reason and other people will like the other one for another. So there's always good reasons to do different things. And again, I'll just weigh out. This time I think I can do 4 grams of resin per cup. All right, and I won't do any talking this time. Doing the exact same thing. The only thing I'm doing is I'm gonna set these aside and walk away for 20 minutes, and then I'll mix them together. So if that doesn't come through on camera, just know that that's what I'm doing. All right, these are all mixed up. I'm gonna give them 20 more minutes and then I'll mix them all together just like I did the last one. All right, it has now been a full 30 minutes since we initially mixed up the batch. Colors are looking great. I've just got, again, one of these PVC pipe scrap pieces ready to go. You can see this time around the resin's really thick. All right, I've got the lathe out. We're ready to go ahead and hollow out the blank. But real quick, let's talk about what to do in case you don't have a lathe. So I'm assuming everyone's going to have at least a hand drill, a power drill, and a set of drill bits like this. So if you take this piece of plywood that we were using earlier, you can hot glue or super glue your piece down to it, and then just use a drill and drill through here. And what's really nice about these measuring cups is they've got a little dimple in the center. And so that gives you a center point to start from. So that way your drill bit's not going to wander. That's one of the most challenging things about drilling things by hand, is getting it centered. So because this is resin, it's gonna be super easy to drill. That divot's gonna give you a great starting point. Just drill all the way through there. And then from there, you should be able to use like a Dremel to sand it out to size. And then just all your standard polishing and finishing techniques that you do on any other ring, like a glowstone ring, for example. So that should be everything you need. You can glue it to a piece like this. What that avoids is using a vise that would put force on it this way, which can risk crushing your ring. It should be fairly strong, but it's kind of hard to tell how much pressure you're exerting on something when you're using a vise. So I like to use this method. If you find that your workpiece keeps slipping out like this, you can go ahead and I would sand a flat spot on either end, and then I'd put it in the vise. The flat spots are gonna prevent it from spinning out, and then just drill right through there. Just be careful not to put too much force on it, because you don't want to crack that blank. Anyways, now let's go ahead and throw this blank up in the chuck of the lathe. Just get it nice and centered. I'll make sure it's clamped down well enough, but not so much that it's going to crush the ring. There we go. Now, just need to clamp down my drill bit, and we'll cut right through it. That was way too easy. Just took like 5 seconds. Check out these shavings. This is so cool. They're nice. They're just black and white, just like the ring we're making. I'd love to find something cool to do with these. We'll figure that out later. But for now, we've got the hole already started on the inside. Now I'm going to take this boring bar, and I'm just going to continue to hollow the ring out until I've got it to, I usually stop at a quarter size under what I'm going for. So if I want to make a size 7 ring, I'll stop at size 6.75. That'll give us enough room to do all the sanding and finishing we need to later in order to get rid of all the deep scratches and grooves that that boring bar will leave. And then once I've got it to the size that I want, instead of sanding and polishing at this step, I like to switch it over to a ring mandrel. That way it won't have a comfort finish to it, and it'll fit on the mandrel a lot better. Then what we'll do is we'll finish the outside of the ring completely. So we'll get it down to its final polish and everything. Then I like to take a layer of tape, protect the outside layer, put it back in the jaws, and then sand and finish the inside of the ring. All right, here's the ring blank after just hollowing it out. I put a bit of motor oil on the inside. That just kind of gives you a preview of what this would look like polished. And I gotta say, that's looking fantastic. Look at all that awesome marbling. That's a cool pattern. And the clear that we put in there, once we shave down the outside, that'll really start to take effect. You'll start noticing it a lot more. It's just gonna look so much better once we do that as well. So now what I need to do, I've got my ring mandrel here. You can see it just perfectly fits on that first step. So I'll just throw it in the lathe. We'll trim down the outer diameter of this ring until we've got it at about for resin rings, I usually like to do kind of like a 2.7 to 3 millimeter thickness between this point and this point here. So right now that's probably about a 6 millimeter thickness over here, and even thicker over here, like 7 millimeter thickness. So I need to trim this down, get it all nice and flush. I'm also going to thin down the ring a little bit. So I think I'll take a little bit off this edge, because I like the pattern that's on this end a lot more. So I'll trim down some of this. I'll go for probably about a 10 millimeter wide ring blank if you guys are curious at home how I'm doing it. So 10 millimeters wide, and then we'll go for about, I'll start at 3 millimeters thick between here and here. And if that's still too thick, I'll just sand a little bit extra. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, now I've got the outside diameter where I want it. You can see the ring itself. It's not too thick, not too thin. If I make any mistakes from this point, I'll be able to go ahead and sand the scratches out. So I'm kind of erring on the side of a little extra thick at the moment, and then I can go back and thin it out if I want to later. But that's what I'd recommend, especially on your first one. Start out pretty thick because you might end up sanding and resanding your ring 2 or 3 times, and then by the end you should have the perfect thickness in theory. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to start with a pretty heavy grit of sandpaper for resin, I should say. So I'll start with 220. That's not a heavy grit if you're working with like a metal, but for resin, 220 is going to be quite rough and it'll work quite quickly and effectively. So I'm just going to I'm going to break the edges, kind of round the ring off. I think I want to keep somewhat of a flatter profile to this ring. I don't want to round it off too much. So I'm just going to break those edges, but still leave it nice and flat overall. And then from there, I'm going to switch over to 500 grit sandpaper, and I'm going to be very thorough with the 500 grit. I just want to get rid of every single little scratch that the 220 left over. And then this next step, I typically will do 1000 grit, 1200 grit, and even 2000 grit after this step. But for this one, I want to really show off the use of our new polish, which we included, by the way. If you guys noticed in the intro, I did not have polish. I completely forgot about it until I got to this step. And so no, that wasn't included in my intro, but yes, that should be included in your box. So if you're wondering why that extra freebie is in there, that's why I just forgot. So what I'm going to do, I'm trying to show off this polish. And so instead of using the 1200 grit and 2000 grit, I'm just gonna go straight into the polish. This should get rid of every single one of the scratches that were left over and leave us with a flawless finish. And I'm super confident in our polish, and that's kind of the point here. Typically I would go much higher, but this polish can actually save you a ton of sanding time. So I'm just gonna go ahead and right after 1000 grit, go straight into the polish, and you guys will see for yourselves at the end that this will leave us a very nice surface finish. All right, now I'm done with the outside diameter of the ring. That was actually pretty straightforward, and the inside from here is gonna be even easier than that. So what I'll do, I'm taking the ring off the mandrel. I'm going to wrap it in a layer or 2 of electric tape. That will protect the ring from the lathe jaws if I clamp too tight on it. I don't wanna leave impressions on the ring that we just worked so hard on getting a nice finish on. So I'm gonna go ahead, clamp it in the lathe, and then I'm just going to size it up to size. Then I'll just switch to sandpaper and do the exact same processes I did on the outside diameter. Essentially, I'm just trying to break the corners, make this a nice, comfortable ring. And then as soon as I'm done with the 220 grit, I'm going to measure the inside diameter, and that should be about a final diameter. The 220 will remove a good bit of material. The 500 grit, that hardly removes anything. So what I like to do is I like to get it pretty close before I do the sanding, and then with the 220 grit, I get it perfectly to size, and then from there on out, I don't worry about it. So I go up to the 500 grit, I do a really thorough job there, get rid of every single teeny little scratch. Then I'll go to the 1000 grit, and then I'll go ahead and hit it with this polish. Now I'll flip the ring around and kind of repeat a lot of those steps. I know it's kind of redundant, but it really is worth it to go ahead and make sure that you have both sides of the ring done really thoroughly. You want to make sure that you break both those edges, just make sure everything's nice and even and consistent. Then once I have all of that sanding and polishing done, we will be finished and I'll be ready to show off the ring. All right guys, here it is finished, and I gotta say, this is a fantastic looking ring. I just love all of that depth, all those swirls, all that detail. I just love the way all of the colors blend together. And then the clear that we put in there, it just really really just kind of brings out all of the detail again. This to me is just a super fun ring to study. If you've got it in your hands, you can sit here and look at it for 15 minutes and you'll still discover new details about it that you didn't notice the first time. So I'm a huge fan of the way that this turned out. I think this is going to be hard to top, but what I'm gonna go ahead and do is I'm just gonna make a ring out of the rest of the blanks that we prepared. Once I get those done, I'll put them all back on camera. We can compare and contrast. I'll talk about what I like about ones, what I don't. All right, I just finished up with all of the rings. These first two are obviously the Neon Mix glow colors, and I think they both turned out awesome. We did the two different mixing techniques to get the two different looks, and I don't want you guys to think this is a right or wrong way to do it. I just want you to know how to get two different looks. So wait till the last minute to mix your colors if you want distinct colors, or if you want them to bleed into each other, mix them right away. And then what's also fun about these is that they glow all sorts of different colors at night as well. So you're not gonna lose that pattern at night. And then finally, we've got the two neon yellow rings. These both just look amazing. Whether it's day or night, they just shine this crazy neon yellow color. So I love that they're super vibrant, yet super simple at the same time. And then you'll notice, because we didn't use the vacuum or any pressure on one of them, it does have a few little voids in it, and they really are accentuated by the fact that they've got some contaminants in there, so that black in there, and I did that on purpose to try to highlight those voids. If you want to get rid of that, make sure to do a really clean sand, and then instead of polishing it, that polishing step is where you get most of the contaminants stuck in there. So don't polish it. As soon as you're done sanding it, as long as the voids are clean of any debris, and then go straight into a CA finish, which will completely seal off the ring and make sure that no contaminants will ever get down into those voids. All right, guys, well, there's all of the rings. All right, guys, that's all of the rings. This was a super ambitious project this month. It was a ton of fun, but please do forgive us for being a bit late with the video this month. There's so many rings to make, it took a long time. So anyways, guys, thank you so much for watching, and we look forward to checking back in with you next month.